Hello and welcome to On Point. My name is Jason Rose. Today, my guest is award-winning journalist and producer, Michael Linder. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jason. Nice to be here.
My pleasure. Now, you started off your career as a journalist,
Right.
all the way starting from high school. You're a journalist now for KABC Radio.
Right.
In between, you created a little show called America's Most Wanted. You executive produced it. Tell me about that.
Well, it was a show that became a phenomenon. It was one of those shows you get maybe once in a career if you're lucky, when you actually come up with something that's lightning in a bottle, and it was. The Fox network was kind of struggling. They didn't have a hit series at that point in time. I'd been living in Tokyo. They were intrigued by this producer saying, what do you think we can do? And we kicked around a bunch of ideas, came up with this notion of putting people's faces on TV, which is very old. KTLA did this in 1947. But the notion of reenacting crimes was really the hook for the show. And America's Most Wanted really started the whole process of reenactments on TV. Today you watch the History Channel, Discovery Channel, it's nothing but reenactments. Nobody was doing that in 1987, 88. So I took a camera crew, went around in 1987, went to the scenes of crimes, filmed them guerrilla style, didn't get permits, just did it on street corners, often drew the cops, you know, like this man with a gun seen at the corner of, right? And the feds wanted nothing to do with us. We based the show in Washington, D.C. The FBI was, held us at arm's length. Here's 10 wanted posters. If you need any help, let us know.
Well, after the very first show, Caught, helped catch one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives.
Right.
How was law enforcement's reaction to you after that happened?
We couldn't get rid of them. It was phone calls at night from cops. It was federal officials coming over. I actually gave a speech to a group of law enforcement officers up in Dover, Delaware, and an entire contingent of police from New Jersey and FBI agents came down with the original case files of a crime that had been out there for 18 years. Took me up to their hotel room, laid out all the evidence, begged me to reenact this crime. It's tough because there were no photos of the guy for 18 years, and nobody knew where he was. So we actually created a bust of John List and had a forensic sculptor create what he thought, given List's diet and personal habits, the man would look like 18 years later. We showed the bust on TV along with a reenactment of the crimes, caught this guy after 18 years on the run. That made page one of the New York Times. The show became a phenomenon. It was the lead gag on a Saturday Night Live episode, made The Simpsons, made a hit of Married with Children, which followed us, and the Fox network was well on its way. And law enforcement really turned a corner in terms of enlisting the public's support in turning in suspected fugitives. We'd catch them sometimes within minutes of the time the show would go on the air. Taping the show in Washington, D.C., we would then feed it to Fox in Los Angeles for playback on the network. And some people would actually watch the closed-circuit satellite feed, see the fugitive, call in, and he'd be captured before we could even get the show on the air. So it was
So, given how much of an influence that had on the catching of fugitives, what is America's Most Wanted's legacy from your view?
I think its legacy is that symbiotic relationship between citizens and law enforcement, because it hadn't been that many, a decade or two, before there was great distrust between the public and police when cops were pigs, and this changed everything. It also made people more aware of their surroundings and the people they were dealing with. And I think it taught a whole lot of people the lesson that you shouldn't get tattooed because your chances of getting apprehended go up 300% if you've got to, they may not recognize your face, but that tattoo will do you in.
Well, given, many people may not know your name, but they have seen a lot of your work. Something else that you did, which is on a whole different scale, Jesse Jackson you worked with.
Yes, with Jesse Jackson in a show that was also interactive. America's Most Wanted's legacy, another one was that it was interactive television. You could pick up the phone and call. We brought in law enforcement officers from around the country to take the calls, dispatch local officers in whatever city that we had a sighting in. We'd put them on a map. And suddenly, interactive media started to work. We tried the same thing with the Jesse Jackson show, which was on the air for a year. airlifting Jesse Jackson into global hotspots to try to make a difference and solve an issue, whether it was a group of Mohawk Indians that were holding a country club as sort of at ransom to protest the building of a golf course over an ancient burial ground, a standoff between them and Canadian police, or going to Baghdad to sit down with Saddam Hussein and try to negotiate an end to the first Persian Gulf War before it actually began. We were more successful with the Indian situation than we were with Saddam, but that was quite an adventure.
What was your experience in Iraq when you went with Jesse Jackson? You met Saddam Hussein.
Yes, twice. And it was difficult getting there because the Bush administration did not want us going there. Saddam Hussein wasn't sure who we were. Perhaps we were sub rosa agents of the State Department or the CIA. Richard Branson, who had Virgin Airways, had a jet stranded at Kuwait Airport. He offered to get us to Baghdad, but since it was now almost a war zone, he couldn't get the insurance to fly us in. Finally, the King of Jordan bumped the entire upper passenger pod of a 747 for myself, my crew, and Jesse Jackson, flew us into Amman, Jordan, put us up at the palace that night, threw us a banquet, and then we went into Saddam International Airport the next morning on the last Lifeline flight. Of course, the airport at that point was lined with anti-aircraft guns. At our first meeting with Saddam, I asked him if we could go into Kuwait. Nobody had seen the nation since it had been occupied. And he thought about it for a minute and said, okay. The next morning, we were given a fleet of limos taken to Saddam's private airport. He had a 727 Iraqi Airways jet gashed up for us, and we flew into occupied Kuwait, took the first videos, walked around the city, and went over to the American Embassy, where the staff had been cut off from food and water, was drinking water out of the swimming pool, where the U.S. ambassador had had something of a nervous breakdown, shook hands with these people and promised that we would get them out. And we did that week, negotiated the release of the American Embassy staff and a total of 227 hostages.
You pioneered, and I'm going to use that word because it really was the first time that the internet was used to get to people high up in government all the way down to the soldiers on the ground to disseminate information from where the action was going on. Berserkistan is what you called it. Tell me about that.
It was a chance to take this new global media that was still in its infancy. This is 1995, and people were still, those who could get on the internet were still doing it with 28.8 modems. And so we wanted to see how far you could push this new medium. I enlisted the help of several young journalists. A couple of them had just come out of the Army, and they went to Bosnia, rode around the country, covering stories at a time when most of the mainstream press corps was afraid to come out of the Holiday Inn in Sarajevo. Taking pictures. There was no mass communications in Bosnia at the time, so these young reporters would have to drive in rented cars up to Croatia, where there was an America Online dial-up node. They could send back the stories as well as their photos, and we had 4-5 stories a day coming out of Bosnia, where CNN only had 1 or 2. In fact, they linked to our website. But the notion of interactive media at that stage was, again, one of the hallmarks, and that was, I never believed that the internet needed to be a read-only medium. And so if we were in a war zone telling a story about something going on, how could we allow the reader to kick in, make a difference?